Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into behavioral economics. You know, that fascinating field that explores how our minds actually work when making choices, not just how those economic models say we should.
Right. Yeah, it's about understanding the hidden forces, the little quirks in our thinking, the ones that can lead us to make decisions that might seem irrational on the surface, but actually make a lot of sense when you look deeper.
I love that. And to guide our exploration, we've got some really interesting excerpts from Nudge, that landmark book by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein.
Oh yeah, you'll like this. One of the first things they do is introduce this concept of two systems of thinking,
Oh, yeah.
what they call the automatic system and the reflective system.
Okay, I love that. It's like thinking of our brains as having a two-driver system.
Exactly. The automatic system is our fast, instinctive reactor. It's the part of us that makes snap judgments and relies on gut feelings. Think of it like our inner Homer Simpson, quick, impulsive, not always the most thoughtful.
And the reflective system,
Yeah.
that's where Spock comes in,
Yeah.
our logical, deliberate side that weighs the pros and cons.
Yeah, precisely. But here's the thing, even when we think we're being all Spock-like and rational, we're often influenced by mental shortcuts called heuristics. They're efficient for everyday decision-making, but sometimes they can lead us down some pretty interesting paths.
So these heuristics are like the brain's time-saving hacks,
Yeah.
but they can also trip us up.
Exactly. Let me give you an example. One of the most common heuristics is called anchoring. This is where we latch onto an initial piece of information, even a totally random one, and use it as a reference point for making judgments.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How does this play out in real life?
Well, Thaler and Sunstein, they describe a study where they asked people to guess the population of Milwaukee.
Okay,
Some participants were first asked if they thought the population was higher or lower than 2 million.
yeah.
Others were asked if it was higher or lower than 300,000.
Wait, so just asking those questions, even though they're totally arbitrary numbers that influence people's guesses?
Absolutely. The group that started with the 2 million anchor guessed significantly higher populations on average than the group that started with the 300,000 anchor.
That's wild. So just by throwing out a random number, you can influence someone's perception.
It highlights how susceptible we are to this anchoring effect. And it's not just with numbers. Think about how this might play out in negotiations, for example.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. If someone starts a negotiation with a really high number, it could anchor my perception of what's a reasonable offer.
You got it. Knowing about anchoring can help us become more aware of how these subtle influences shape our perceptions and decisions.
It's like having a secret weapon in negotiations. So besides anchoring, what are some other heuristics we should be on the lookout for?
Well, another common one is availability. This is the tendency to overestimate the likelihood of events that are easily recalled, things that are vivid, dramatic, or recent in our memory.
So like after seeing a news report about a plane crash, we might suddenly feel like flying is super dangerous, even though statistically it's incredibly safe.
Exactly. Our minds latch on to those vivid images and stories, and they become more readily available to us. Makes them seem more probable than they actually are.
That makes so much sense.
Hmm.
Our emotions are like a mental highlighter, making certain events stand out in our memory.
Yeah, and that can have a huge impact on our decision making, especially when it comes to things like risk assessment.
You know, this reminds me of something I read about how people perceive the risks of different causes of death.
Oh, what did you find interesting about that?
Well, the research showed that people tend to overestimate the likelihood of dying from things like shark attacks or tornadoes, events that are certainly dramatic, but statistically quite rare.
That's availability bias at work. Yeah, those events make for great headlines and scary movies, so they stick in our minds.
But we often underestimate the risks of things that are far more common, but less dramatic, like heart disease or car accidents.
Precisely, yeah, those everyday risks just don't have the same emotional punch, so they don't feel as threatening, even though they're statistically much more likely to harm us.
So we're basically walking around with these distorted risk maps in our heads, influenced by our emotions and the stories we tell ourselves.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And that brings us to another fascinating heuristic, representativeness, which is all about how we judge probabilities based on how well something fits our mental stereotypes.
Oh, this is where our snap judgments about people and situations come into play, right?
Exactly. Thaler and Sunstein use the classic example of Linda the bank teller to illustrate this bias. In the study, people were given a description of Linda as someone who's very bright, outspoken, and concerned with social justice. Then they were asked to rank the likelihood of various statements about her, including Linda is a bank teller, And Linda is a bank teller and active in the feminist movement.
Now, logically, it's more probable that she's simply a bank teller than a bank teller who's also a feminist activist.
Hmm.
But what did people say?
Well, most people ranked Linda as a bank teller and active in the feminist movement as more likely.
Wow, really? Even though that defies basic probability.
Yes. They fell prey to the representativeness bias. Linda's description seemed to fit the stereotype of a feminist activist, so they judged that as more likely, even though it was statistically less probable.
So we're essentially trying to fit people and events into neat little boxes based on our preconceived notions.
Precisely. And that can lead to some pretty faulty judgments, especially when we're dealing with complex situations or making predictions about the future.
I think I'm starting to see these heuristics at work in my own life already. It's like a whole new way of understanding how my mind works.
That's the first step. By recognizing these patterns, you can start to question your assumptions and make more conscious choices.
This is fascinating stuff. But before we get too deep into how to overcome these biases, I'm curious about one more thing. Thaler and Sunstein also talk about something called the hot hand fallacy, right?
They do. That's another great example of how representativeness can mislead us. Many basketball fans and even some players believe that if a player has made a few shots in a row, they're more likely to make the next one. This is the idea of the hot hand.
Yeah, like they're on a roll and can't miss.
Exactly. But when researchers actually analyzed shot data, they found that the hot hand is largely a myth.
Well, so those streaks of amazing shots are really just random fluctuations.
More often than not, yes. Our brains are wired to see patterns, even when they don't exist.
It's like we're always looking for meaning, even in randomness.
That's right. And that tendency can be beneficial in many ways. But it can also lead us to see patterns where there are none, like in the case of the hot hand.
So even experienced athletes and coaches can be fooled by this illusion of a pattern.
Absolutely. And this doesn't just apply to basketball. It can show up in any domain where we're trying to predict future events based on perceived patterns in the past.
This is making me rethink everything I thought I knew about luck and skill.
That's the beauty of behavioral economics.
Yeah.
It challenges our assumptions about how we think and make choices.
I'm definitely starting to see the world in a new light.
That's what we're here for, to nudge your thinking a little bit.
Okay, we've covered anchoring, availability, and representativeness. What other fascinating quirks of the human mind are we going to uncover? Let's take a quick break and then dive back in. All right, so we've seen how these mental shortcuts, these heuristics, can lead us to make some pretty interesting choices. But where does overconfidence fit into all of this? I feel like that's got to play a role in our decision-making too.
Oh, absolutely. Overconfidence is a pervasive bias. It's the tendency to overestimate our abilities, our knowledge, and even our chances of success.
So it's like we all have a little bit of that Lake Wobegon effect going on where everyone thinks they're above average.
Exactly. Thaler and Sunstein talk about this, how something like 90% of drivers think they're better than the average driver. Statistically, that's impossible, right?
Yeah. It's almost endearing, though, isn't it, that little boost of self-belief? I can see how it could lead us into trouble, too.
It certainly can. Overconfidence can make us underestimate risks and take on more than we can handle. It can also make us resistant to feedback and less likely to learn from our mistakes.
That makes sense. So how do we balance that need for a healthy sense of self-efficacy with the dangers of overconfidence?
It's a delicate balance. I think it's about being aware of our tendencies towards overconfidence and seeking out objective feedback whenever possible.
So having trusted friends or colleagues who can give us a reality check now and then.
Exactly, yeah. People who can help us see our blind spots and challenge our assumptions.
Okay, that makes sense. Now let's talk about another aspect of decision-making that I think we can all relate to: temptation.
Ah, yes, the classic struggle between our long-term goals and those immediate desires.
It's like that moment when you're determined to eat healthy all week and then someone brings in a box of donuts to the office.
That's a perfect example. Thaler and Sunstein, they use the term dynamic inconsistency to describe this phenomenon. The way our preferences can change over time depending on whether we're in a hot state of temptation or a cold state of reflection.
So in the heat of the moment, the donut wins. But later, when we're thinking more clearly, we might regret giving in.
Right. It's that classic battle between our planner self, the one who sets goals and makes plans, and our doer self, the one who acts on impulse and seeks immediate gratification.
It's like we have these two little characters battling it out inside our heads.
Exactly. And sometimes the doer just overpowers the planner.
So how can we help our planners win more of those battles?
Well, one strategy is to recognize our own patterns of temptation and try to anticipate those hot states.
So if I know that I'm more likely to crave sweets when I'm stressed, I might avoid the bakery aisle altogether when I'm feeling overwhelmed.
Exactly. Another strategy is to create what Thaler and Sunstein call choice architecture, environments that make it easier to make good choices and harder to make bad ones.
So instead of relying solely on willpower, we can set up our surroundings to support our goals.
Precisely. For example, if you're trying to save money, you could set up automatic transfers to your savings account so that you're less tempted to spend that money.
Oh, that takes the decision out of the equation. I like it.
Right. It's about using our knowledge of our own weaknesses to our advantage.
Now, this brings up something else I wanted to ask you about. The power of defaults. Thaler and Sunstein argue that defaults can have a huge influence on our choices, even if we don't realize it.
Absolutely, yeah. Defaults are those pre-selected options that we often just go with, especially when we're busy or not paying close attention.
It's like those online forms where the box for sign me up for the newsletter is already checked.
Exactly. We tend to just accept whatever is presented to us as the default, even if it's not really what we want.
So how can we be more mindful of these defaults and make sure they're actually serving us?
Well, first, it's just about being aware that they exist. Once you start noticing defaults, you'll be surprised how often they pop up in your life.
I'm starting to see them everywhere already.
Yeah. The second step is to take a moment to pause and consider whether the default option is really what you want.
Don't just blindly click accept.
Right. Think about what's best for you and then make a conscious choice.
That makes sense. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about another fascinating concept from the book, mental accounting. This is how we tend to categorize and manage our money in our minds, right?
That's right. It's as if we have these separate mental accounts for different purposes: rent, groceries, entertainment, vacation, and so on.
And even though money is technically fungible, a dollar is a dollar, we often treat it differently depending on which mental account it belongs to.
Precisely. Thaler and Sunstein use the example of people who have money sitting in a low-interest savings account while simultaneously carrying high-interest credit card debt.
Logically, it would make sense to use some of that savings to pay down the debt, right?
Exactly. But psychologically, it can feel different. Dipping into savings might feel like a loss, while keeping the debt separate somehow feels less painful, even though it's costing them more in the long run.
That's so interesting. So our emotions are essentially overriding our logic when it comes to managing our finances.
Often, yeah. And that's why understanding mental accounting can be so helpful. It allows us to see these patterns and make more rational choices.
Okay, so how can we use this knowledge of mental accounting to our advantage?
Well, one strategy is to try to view our finances more holistically. Instead of thinking about money in these rigid, separate categories, try to consider your overall financial picture.
So it's like zooming out and seeing the whole financial landscape instead of getting caught up in the individual trees.
Exactly. Another strategy is to be mindful of how marketers and retailers might be using mental accounting to influence our spending.
Oh, I'm sure they're playing all sorts of mind games with us.
They certainly are. Think about things like store credit cards or loyalty programs that offer points or rewards.
They make it feel like we're getting something for free or saving money, but we might actually be spending more overall.
Exactly. By understanding these tactics, we can be more savvy consumers and make choices that align with our actual financial goals.
Now, speaking of influences, let's talk about the power of social forces in shaping our decisions. Thaler and Sunstein dedicate a whole section of nudge to this idea, right?
They do. Humans are social creatures by nature, and we're constantly being influenced by the people around us, whether we realize it or not.
So it's not just about our own internal biases and heuristics. We're also susceptible to the pressures and norms of our social groups.
Absolutely. Think about something as simple as choosing a restaurant. You're more likely to go to a place that's crowded, even if you've never heard of it, than an empty one, right?
It's like we're following the herd, assuming that the crowd must know something we don't.
Exactly. This is what's known as social proof, and it can be a powerful influence on our behavior.
So we're more likely to do something if we see others doing it, even if it goes against our own better judgment.
That's right. And this tendency to conform isn't just about where we eat or what we buy. It can influence everything from our political views to our investment decisions.
This reminds me of that classic experiment, the Asch conformity experiment, where people were shown lines of different lengths and asked to match them up.
Ah, yes. The one where everyone in the group except the real participant gives the obviously wrong answer.
Exactly. And even though the participant knows it's wrong, they often conform to the group's opinion just to fit in.
It's a powerful demonstration of how much we crave social acceptance. even if it means going against our own beliefs.
It's almost like we're hardwired to follow the crowd.
In many ways, we are. But the good news is that, just like with our other biases, awareness is key. Once we understand how social influence works, we can start to question our assumptions and make more independent choices.
So maybe next time I see a long line at a restaurant, I'll pause and ask myself, am I really that hungry? Or am I just being swayed by the crowd?
Exactly. It's about being a conscious decision maker, not just a mindless follower.
Now, besides conformity, what are some other ways that social forces shape our behavior?
Well, Thaler and Sunstein talk about the spotlight effect, which is the tendency to overestimate how much others notice us.
It's like we think we're always on stage with everyone watching our every move.
Right. But the reality is that people are generally far less observant than we think.
So we're all walking around with this imaginary audience in our heads, judging our every move.
That's the idea, and this fear of judgment can make us even more likely to conform to social norms.
It's like we're trying to blend in with a wallpaper, afraid to stand out.
Exactly. But the ironic thing is that by trying so hard to conform, we might actually be drawing more attention to ourselves.
So the key is to find that sweet spot between being authentically ourselves and being mindful of social norms.
Precisely. It's about finding that balance between fitting in and standing out.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, are there any other social influences we should be on the lookout for?
Well, there's the concept of priming, which is the idea that subtle cues in our environment can influence our thoughts and behaviors without us even realizing it.
So like those subliminal messages they used to talk about in movies? But this is actually real.
It is. Thaler and Sunstein give the example of a study where people were asked to unscramble sentences that included words associated with old age. Words like wrinkle or Florida.
Okay, so they were primed with these thoughts of aging. What happened then?
Well, after completing the task, the participants were timed as they walked down a hallway. Those who had been primed with the old age words actually walked more slowly.
Wow, really? Just from unscrambling a few sentences.
It's a powerful example of how subtle cues can have a measurable effect on our behavior.
That's pretty mind-blowing. So it's like our brains are constantly picking up on these little signals from our environment and adjusting our behavior accordingly.
Exactly. And it's happening all the time beneath the surface of our conscious awareness.
So we're not just influenced by the people around us, we're also influenced by the objects, the words, the images, everything in our environment.
That's right.
Yeah.
Our minds are constantly interacting with the world around us, and those interactions shape our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors in ways that we often don't even realize.
This is giving me a whole new appreciation for the power of context.
It's certainly something to consider. Now, before we move on, I want to touch on one more important aspect of social influence: the power of stories.
Oh, yes. Stories are such a fundamental part of human experience. How do they factor into all of this?
Well, Thaler and Sunstein argue that stories are incredibly effective at conveying information and influencing behavior.
I can see that. A good story can grab our attention and make us care about something in a way that dry facts and figures often can't.
Exactly. Stories engage our emotions and make information more memorable.
It's like those fables and fairy tales we hear as children. They teach us moral lessons and shape our understanding of the world.
Precisely. And this power of stories doesn't go away as we get older.
So marketers and politicians, and even our friends and family, are all using stories to influence us.
All the time. Think about how often you hear people using anecdotes or personal experiences to support their arguments.
It's like those commercials that tell heartwarming stories to sell us products.
Exactly. Stories are powerful tools of persuasion. And that's why it's so important to be critical consumers of information and to question the stories we're being told.
So don't just accept a story at face value. Dig a little deeper. Consider the source and ask yourself, what might be motivating the storyteller?
That's good advice. Critical thinking is essential in a world where we're bombarded with information and stories from all directions.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, from anchoring and availability to social proof and the power of stories. It's amazing how much is going on beneath the surface of our conscious awareness.
It is fascinating, isn't it? And we've only just scratched the surface of what behavioral economics has to offer.
I'm already starting to see the world in a new light. But before we wrap up, I'm curious, what are some practical takeaways from all of this? How can we use this knowledge to make better decisions in our own lives?
That is a great question. I think the biggest takeaway for me is just this idea of awareness, just knowing about these biases and heuristics. It can make a big difference, just in how we approach making decisions.
I completely agree. It's like shining a light on those mental shortcuts that we're all taking,
Yeah.
often without even realizing it.
Yeah. So instead of just reacting on autopilot, we can start to pause and ask ourselves, is this decision really in my best interest?
Mhm.
Or am I being swayed by some unconscious bias?
Precisely. And that pause, that moment of reflection can be incredibly powerful.
Yeah, it's like we're taking back control of our decision-making process.
Exactly. Now, another practical takeaway is the power of choice architecture.
Oh, yeah.
That idea we talked about earlier, designing environments that nudge us towards better choices. So instead of just trying to fight our biases head on, we can set up our surroundings to make it easier to do the right thing.
That's the idea. Think about something like saving for retirement. It can feel daunting, right?
Oh, yeah.
But if your employer automatically enrolls you in a retirement plan and you have to actively opt out, you're much more likely to start saving earlier.
Yeah, it's like making the default option the one that's best for most people.
Exactly. And this principle can be applied to all sorts of areas of our lives, from health and fitness to finances and even our social interactions.
This reminds me of something Thaler and Sunstein talk about in the book, libertarian paternalism. It sounds like an oxymoron, but they argue that it's possible to nudge people towards better choices while still respecting their freedom of choice.
That's a key point. It's not about manipulating people or taking away their choices. It's about using our understanding of human behavior to design environments
Hmm.
that make it easier for people to make choices that are in their long-term best interest.
Yeah, so it's like we're creating a world where the healthy choice is also the easy choice.
Exactly. And I think that's a really powerful idea.
Now, before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you about one more thing. The role of emotions in all of this. We've talked a lot about cognitive biases, but emotions must play a role in our decision-making too, right?
Oh, absolutely. They're a fundamental part of who we are and they can have a huge influence on our choices.
It's like that old saying, we're not thinking machines that feel, we're feeling machines that think.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Our emotions can sometimes lead us astray, of course, but they can also provide valuable information and guide us towards choices that align with our values and goals.
So it's not about ignoring our emotions. It's about understanding how they influence our thinking and just making sure they're not, leading us down the wrong path.
Exactly. And sometimes that means taking a step back, letting that initial emotional wave subside,
Mhm.
and then making a more rational decision.
So it's all about finding that balance between our heads and our hearts.
Precisely. It's about integrating our emotions and our reason into a cohesive decision-making process.
This has been an incredible deep dive. I feel like I've gained a whole new understanding of how my mind works and how I can make better choices.
I'm so glad to hear that. And remember, this is just the beginning. The more you learn about behavioral economics, the more you'll start to see its principles at work in your everyday life.
Yeah, it's like we've been given a new lens through which to view the world, and now that we know about these nudges, they have less power over us.
Exactly. Knowledge is power, as they say.
Mm.
And by understanding these subtle influences, we can become more conscious and deliberate decision makers.
Well, I don't know about you, but I'm feeling pretty empowered right now,
Mm-mm.
and I can't wait to start spotting these nudges in the wild.
I have no doubt you will, and I encourage all of our listeners to do the same. Pay attention to your own thinking, notice those moments when you're being nudged, and then make the choice that's right for you. Such great advice. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure. And remember, keep those minds nudged and those choices empowered.